Okay, so what I've, as it is the 17th day of Tammuz, I have collected here a mix of stories of destruction that have, most of them should be at least somewhat familiar to everyone. There's not an attempt to teach many things that are new, but each story I'd like to give a little twist, either a little personal anecdote or some type of added piece of information that I think helps us better appreciate these stories. There are some of them that we're going to be using over and over and over again, and I think some of these things may be able to enhance the guiding that we do at this site and our appreciation of them. So let's get started. Okay, I'm just going to make you guys smaller. Here we go. So just to review, the 17th day of Tammuz, we have Moses breaking the tablets. This is from the Aish website, adapted. During the Babylonian siege, Jews were forced to stop the offering of the daily sacrifice. Their two next one are somewhat unclear. Some figure named Apostomos who burned the Torah scroll, and an idol that was placed in the holy temple. We're not clear whether or not Apostomos sounds like someone in the Greek period, maybe someone a Hellenistic ruler relating to something a little bit later, but it's somewhere in the Second Temple period. There isn't a clear knowledge of when exactly that was. And lastly, the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans in 69 after a lengthy siege, and 3 weeks later, the temple being destroyed on the 9th of Ab. In the First Temple period, the breaching of the walls was done in a slightly different time. However, in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's also the date in the First Temple period, even though the Bible has somewhat of a different dating system, but we're not going to be dealing with that now. So it's an appropriate date today. What this is sort of 17th day of Tammuz is like the beginning of the end, meaning it's not the final destruction in the 9th of Av, but it builds up to it. And part of the 3-week period that we're now entering is building up to the 9th of Av. If we have the 9th of Av just standing in the middle of nowhere, it wouldn't be, we wouldn't really be able to appreciate it. And this is sort of a way to get into things. Just like we have happy time of year that we build up, let's say at Sukkot, we build up to the pinnacle of our happiness. Here we do the opposite. Okay, so let's get started in Area G, which I think is known to everyone, but you're not familiar with, is that during the excavations, many of the archaeologists and the workers there would be coming home completely covered with this grayish, whitish ash. Because even though what we look at today, and unfortunately we're looking at it with all the pyrotechnics on top of it, but this is from a few years ago, what they found above the Area G was almost a meter thick of this ash that was the debris. Now, it was dirt, but when we have dirt can be divided. Like one of the things that archaeologists like Eskimos with snow, we have 50 different names and colors of dirt. There's chocolate and there's this, that, but ash, which is mixed with burnt organic material, is distinct, and you can see it, you can smell it, and you're coming home with it every single day. And so the destruction of Area G is something that was very much alive, and the fire that is mentioned in the Bible, that the Babylonians burnt the city down, could be seen in many different places. You could really see the effects of fire, the warping of the ceramics, and as we're going to see, it also changed. So it was able to think. So we all are familiar with the burnt wall, but with the burnt house, which we're going to see a little bit later. But there was a room here that was so burnt, I didn't really have a name for it like they gave for the house of Achiel, but they called it the burnt room. This is from Yigal Shiloh's publication. This is the burnt room, which was so burnt that you could really see that destruction. So in the midst of all this, it did find some very distinct aspects of the destruction and what led up to the destruction. Now, the one that hopefully everyone is familiar with, we'll start with, and that, of course, is the commode, one of the earliest toilets found in excavations. We have since found a few more, but you should be aware that in the Talmud Bavli, in a discussion of what is the distinctive features of a wealthy person. So it says, there are a number of rabbis that give different opinions, but Rabbi Yosei, he says, Kol shebeit kis'o samuch l'shulchano. Anyone whose bathhouse is near their table, literally, which means anybody that had indoor plumbing. And this was a sign of a wealthy person, which was something that was very unique. As I like to say, like, when you think about living in the ancient world, I'd love to live in this time period. I wouldn't want to live in any period before indoor plumbing, which is something that, again, we take for granted. We'll see plumbing is going to be a theme. But one of the things that happened in Area G because of the fire is that Bullae, which we're all familiar with. Of course, these are the stamps that are impressed mud, which are usually just dried in the sun, and they usually would just disintegrate, and therefore we don't find them in every single site because they'd be disintegrated in the mud. Here they were burnt, and therefore they were able to harden as ceramics and were able to withstand the 2,700 years or so that they've been, that they've been sitting there. So what we have here is a group. Now, of course, you're familiar. They found about 50 of them, and you're familiar with some. I'm not going to go through all the lists now. One of them, by the way, you should be aware, Baruch ben Neriah, if it is authentic, it's one of the most exciting ones because he was the scribe of Jeremiah, as Jeremiah was sitting in the prison, not able to have receiving prophecies. It seems that Baruch ben Neriah was the one that wrote those prophecies down. However, this one was not found in the excavation. It turned up in one of the shops up in the old city a few days later, but many have considered this to be authentic. So I'll leave that one open. The ones that Eilat Mazar found direct us directly to the last chapter of Jerusalem's history, and that, of course, is Yehuchal ben Shlomyahu, mentioned as one of the ministers of the kingdom of Melchizedek. And just one point that I like to make here is that whenever with people, which it's even slightly, an issue politically of the city of David, you have to realize that much of what we speak about there, you can't see. You talk about David's palace, this and that, and a lot of things are very much speculative. But when they say what is real, what can you touch from that time period, the Bullae, this one, and the one of Yehuchal ben Shlomyahu, the one of Gedaliah ben Pashchur, the two ministers of Tzidkiyahu that were active in that area, whether or not it was the royal residence or whether or not it was just administrative buildings, it still is something very tangible and something that you can highlight how much that is something that is very, that you can put your hands on. Another Bullae that might have lost the radar was found in the ones that of Yigal Shiloh, and that's Azariah ben Chilkiyahu. Okay, Azariah ben Chilkiyahu, who, if you look very carefully, is mentioned in the book of Ezra. It says, the beginning of this is the beginning of the chapter. It's only chapter 7, but it's the one that begins to talk about Ezra. Ben Sraya, Ben Azariah, Ben Chilkiah. So if it looks like this is Ezra's grandfather. Okay, Ezra is really coming to Jerusalem in the year 458. That his grandfather had a Bullae in Jerusalem in 586. It's possible, but we could be missing one or two generations here, and they were squashed together, although it still is possible. But so this would be Ezra's grandfather, and I like to usually, when I speak about the different Bullae, it's you can link between the destruction that you're looking at and Ezra, who in very many ways represents the return to Jerusalem, and that's one. We'll talk about the Givati parking lot. They just found brand new ones that I haven't yet fit into the scheme of things, but let's go look at another one that also is somewhat overlooked. Eilat Mazar found one that's not a boule. This is the actual stamp, which means that when she rushed to the press with this, which is something that Eilat does a little bit too often, the first publication, she read it backwards. But this has to be read opposite, from left to right. And whoops. And that, so it says Shin Lamed. I'm trying to get my pointer here. Let's see if I can get a pointer. Okay, it's Shin Lamed Mem, and this is a Tuf. This is an X, so this is a Tuf. Shin Lamed Mem Tuf. So it's a stamp with some type of a cultic stand and incense and two Babylonian figures. They look female, or one male, one female, that are standing next to it and doing some type of a thing. Whatever that is, these are in Semitic letters. So it says Shin Lamed Mem Tuf. What does that say? So I had a few good options over the years. Someone said Shalemet. This is the stamp, or Shilamta. It's the stamp that you paid. I don't know that that's it, but the option that I think would be the most exciting, if it's authentic, comes from the book of Chronicles, Divrei Yamim, that lists all the descendants of Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel, Ezra and Nehemiah are the more famous ones, but Zerubbabel was the one of the seed of David that led the small group of Jews that came back in the first Shivat Zion, that's known as that, right? And it says Ubnei Zerubbabel, Shim'i ben Zerubbabel Meshulam v'Chananiah uShlomit achotam. So Shlomit, okay, this very well could be Shlomit. As we know, of the Bullae that we have from the First Temple period, and now we're in the hundreds already of examples from many different sites, we do have I wouldn't say more than 20%, but between 10 to 15% of women's names, which is something that is not something we necessarily could have expected. There are women that are mentioned, Amat HaMelech and Bat HaMelech, and all kinds of different names that were positions in the house. They weren't necessarily all queens, but they were administrative positions within the infrastructure of the monarchy. Whatever the case is, you had to be pretty special to have a seal, and the location, Eilat found it just to the base of this tower we used to know as Tower 2. Now, as we know, Tower 2 fell apart. As Eilat excavated around it, it completely crumbled. And therefore, she went ahead and got permission to excavate this properly. She dated the material directly underneath the tower to the Persian period, because it had pottery from the Persian period and from the very well-known story of the two canine burials, the dogs that were buried there, which is something we find only in the Persian period and the modern period. Burial of canines is something and maybe you can say the Natufian. I think we have one dog buried in the Natufian, but that's a little bit off radar for most people. In any case, this, which does not exist anymore, the tower, is seen to be part of a very early wall that originally Gal Shiloh thought to be the foundations in the Hasmonean period, or maybe even earlier. But if it's very poorly built, it might go back to the description of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, he didn't rebuild the wall with a contracting company. He had every family rebuild or build from scratch, whatever was necessary, the portion of wall that was opposite their homes. which is what is described in the different chapters of Nehemiah. And this would fit the nature of the building of this tower, which was very, very poorly built from the bottom to the top, is something that would fit that description. So very often when I end the descriptions of Area G is where we have possibly the first imprint of the Davidic line in Jerusalem, and it's also where we have the very end. We have the two bookends from David all the way to Shlomit, the last of the Davidic line mentioned in Tanakh almost, and the last person that we have related to David in the First Temple period, now the Second Temple period, but in excavation. Another little episode that I just saw, it just came up in the news last week, around the Israelite, one of the most amazing finds that around the Israelite tower that we should be familiar with, wasn't necessarily the pottery, but were the arrowheads. I couldn't find a picture online of the arrowheads. This one is from the recent excavations in of the different foreign universities on Mount Zion. They found what's called a Scythian arrowhead. These were the Babylonian arrowheads. Now, what was so special about them is they were amazingly piercing of the skin. They usually also had little, it would stick, you can't see it from this profile, but it would be sticking out. And that means that if you pulled it out of the flesh, it would rip the flesh out with it. It's pretty awful. The Romans later copied some of these designs. This was the most advanced weapon. It really gave them an advantage over the Assyrians. This is, by the way, the article that was from last week describing the recent study that Tel Aviv University did about them finding them all over the country. So this is like, whenever we see these arrowheads, we have this very live picture of what happened in the last minutes of the thing. And I forgot, sorry, I didn't talk about the as we were doing it, I went through the whole point of the toilet is to discuss what happened in the siege, because what they discovered underneath, as I was busy talking about the color of the dirt, was that the dirt under here wasn't exactly a whitish color. It had different colors to it, and they tested it. It did have a significant amount of human fecal matter. Now, that can be put under a microscope, and two elements that were put under a microscope, you can read this in a BAR article called It Had to Happen, what they found in underneath there, and they found two elements there. One are remnants of pollen. Now, the pollen there was from some normal vegetables, but also some plants that would be on the either weeds or semi-poisonous. Now, what were people eating weeds at this time? We're talking about during the siege, and they were eating anything they could get their hands on. The other thing that you could see from this they found was that there were eggs from tapeworms, from parasites, that are evidence that people were eating non-cooked or poorly cooked or uncooked meat. Why were you eating your meat? Any wood would be used for the arrows, to counter the arrows that were coming in, and it would mean that the people that and they would, and you wouldn't be the image that we have of people eating up their livestock that are now competitors for food as well. This is like, these are the descriptions that you have in Eicha of the terrible hunger that you had towards the end of the siege in the Babylonian siege. Okay, sorry I missed that one. And now let's get back on. So let's move on to the Second Temple period. The only thing I like to say about this is Jerusalem in its splendor is usually what we have when we look at Jerusalem, especially from the perspective of this beautiful model. But Jerusalem, first of all, never looked like this. First of all, it was never this clean. It was probably much, much dirtier. But that's beyond the point. Jerusalem, we have a statement that Bait Charev Checharavti, that I destroyed a destroyed building. It might have been beautiful, but its beauty was not compatible with the social structure that existed there, the wealthy and the poor that were, the wealth did not take care of each other, but also this wall, the third wall here, that was begun by Agrippa only in the year 40, in the year in the 40s, meaning that it was not around when Jesus was there. So the city was, that's something also to stress. But it was only completed in a very haphazard way by the rebels in the year 66. This fits also with what Roni Reich and Eli Shukron want to tell us about the temple itself, and the compound really was never completed until just a few years before the destruction, something that Josephus mentioned in the New Testament, and it's something that archaeology, they would like to say that the entire southern corner was only built in the beginning of the middle of the first century. So this picture of Jerusalem that we have of this build was really just a snapshot. It only existed for maybe a half a generation, if that, from and it's something that we have to put things into perspective. We talk about the physical beauty of Jerusalem. In terms of the destruction, we're all familiar with the burnt house and the stories of the arm that was found. I couldn't find a picture on the internet available, but I have it on my book here, of the young girl. That arm was severed there in the picture. And so these are very alive places that you talk about the destruction, but I think it's even more so when we have the road, the Pilgrim's Road, which is hopefully when everything is over here, it's going to be open to the public. This is what they found in the early 2000s. This is what much of it looks like today. But again, the story that goes back to destruction is, of course, what they found here. Now, it was closed off the last few months before this thing, but when they found it, you should realize that I was there when they were digging it out. There were hundreds of coins under here from the end of the revolt. I excavated one season in Sipori, and every single coin we used to give a old film canister. I have to explain to children today what an old film canister is, because it was so special. Here, I remember the guys, they had cut off Coke bottles filled with coins from the last few years of the revolt. But in the midst of those things, they also found something else, which I hope everybody is familiar with. But if you're not, is they found complete cooking pots. Now, a complete cooking pot you don't find in excavation. In archaeology, we have two different words for complete. In Hebrew, we call it shalem and tamim. In English, complete, which means or intact. So the proper word is intact, not complete. Complete means that all the pieces, 95% of the pieces, are found in situ in the place where it was deposited. But intact means it's intact. Intact you find in tombs maybe, but you don't find it in excavation. These are intact, which means that they were brought down there very shortly before these were finished. And of course, I usually read the section. If you're not familiar with, I'll read it now for you from this translation of Josephus. Josephus, from the very last page of the chapter, which is Temple Burnt and City Taken. So the very last page, it says, "But now fate had decreed that one prison should confine the whole nation, and that a city solid with men should be held fast in war's embrace. No destruction ever wrought by God or man approached the wholesale carnage of this war. Every man who showed himself was either killed or captured by the Romans, and then those in the sewers were ferreted out, and the ground was torn up, and all that were trapped were killed." Now, if I do the assumption that if people are thinking of escaping the city, their most likely place to get out is from the south. If I'm going to make another assumption that the Romans will start at the top and work their way to the bottom. What we have here, again, they could just smoke them out or something, but you have these 6-foot legionnaires that have been around the city. This is probably already pushing the a few weeks after the destruction, and they're furious. The one thing they want to do is go home. But they were given the order that you're not leaving anyone here alive. Everyone has to be captured or taken into slavery or killed. And so you can see every few steps that the stone pavement was smashed open to take out these last survivors that were literally the last people that, were in the bottom of this street that started all the way up over here and all, but we find the holes down here. They could have taken them out of the sewers from the manholes that were up farther north, but down here they're done with the manholes. It goes, all these lead right into the pool, and they left nothing, no stone unturned, in order to smash them open and take out the last few survivors. So these would be the very, very last survivors. Now, these were discovered. Eli Shukron tells the story much more like Hanukkah. They were published Hanukkah time. Somebody unmuted themselves. If you can mute yourself, that'd be great. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but please, if you're unmuted and if you're not me, please mute yourself. A few people.
I'm working on it.
Okay. At the time it was just open to the public. A little shortly after, I was working for Ir David at the time, and Ami Mazar had wanted to come and see it. So he asked me, I was in contact with him on a paper I was writing, and so he asked me if I could take him around. He didn't want to go through any of the archaeologists. He says they drive them crazy. So he asked me to bring him here. And I remember walking him in here, and he started looking around. He's from a family of survivors, and the first thing that he could think about was the Warsaw Ghetto. And so he was immediately made that connection. If you're not familiar, one of the methods of escape from the Nazis, both in and out of the ghetto and inside the ghetto as they're uprising, were the underground sewer system, which is pretty developed. They've redone it today so people can see it, and they even made one of the monuments to the uprising is the entrance to to one of the sewers. And so what I like to say is, like, you imagine these people that are there, they think this is the end of the end. And what they would think if we were back 2,000 years later, standing at that very point, the same thing can be said about the heroic people that fought here just 70 years ago. That they imagine that we would be able to come back and visit Warsaw or do this or talk about the sewers in Jerusalem. It'd be pretty amazing. Now, another custom, which many of you may have seen, it's usually done very quickly, and that is to take ash and you put a little ash on the groom's forehead. It's an Ashkenazi custom, although some Sephardim have adopted it today. It's mentioned in the earlier sources. It's called Efer Makle. So when I got married, I was already guiding, and the burnt room, you could get into it. I jumped over in the burnt room, and no, not in the burnt room. I got it in Herodian Quarter. They still had some of the dirt out. So the ash that I had on my forehead, I didn't have a picture available now, is a mixture of the ash from Area G and a mixture of the ash from the Herodian Quarter. Now it's all covered over with boxes they used to have that people could take a little bit. I only took a tiny bit. Now you actually shared it with some of my friends, so it was a little bit more meaningful than having some burnt envelope or something, which is usually what people use. Okay, so that's the Second Temple period. And afterwards, the Romans issued this coin, and they thought this was the end of the Jewish people. It says Judea Capta. We may be all familiar with them. Just a few things about these amazing coins. The Romans issued about 30 or 40 of them in gold, in bronze, and in silver. They were Titus, Vespasian, and Domitian, the Titus's brother, and later and who ruled directly after him. And there were a few different styles. You can see some are standing this way and some are standing that way. This one is a gold one. The idea, though, is this is Judea and this is Rome, and this represents the palm tree representing this region also. And the Rome standing triumphant usually carries some of the attributes of the triumph. And that's the coin that was issued, and we find all over. We found a few actually in Jerusalem. This one is the most interesting, I think. This was issued by Agrippa the second, Herod's grandson. With the time, he took part. His armies took part in the destruction of Jerusalem. He was Roman. Anyway, he issued these Judea Captas, or which actually mentioned his own name. So he was part of that crazy story there. These were issued in Tiberias very shortly after the destruction in 71, 72, 73. And Israel has decided a few times to put a Galta Yehuda, which they have a medallion which has the chains, and it has a very similar depiction of what we had in the Roman. And then Asor Lecherut Israel. This is in 1958. Israel Liberata. Israel has been redeemed. Okay, so what we could assume is that after the Second Temple period, everything was destroyed. And I'll mention later an anecdote that's related to that, but it's not the case. There are two sites that I'm going to share with you now. Again, you may be familiar with them, but what was so interesting about Khirbet Ivri, which is in the Adulam forest, this is the road from Tzomet Ha'ilah to Maresha Bet Guvrin. You can go in here. Many people are familiar with Khirbet Midras, which you can't go in right now, right next to Givat Yishai. When you continue down the road from Khirbet Midras, there are two sites which are very, very interesting and worth going to. Tel Adulam is right on, by the way, it's fascinating because it's right on the Kavat Efer. It's an amazing view of what's going on both sides of the Green Line. But it's better usually with a 4x4 to get over here. But Itri and Bourguin both have two very, very interesting things about them. This is a view from Itri. This is what it looked like during the time. Now, it's a site from the Second Temple period that everybody knew. Etri, it's probably the proper pronunciation. It's mentioned in some of the sources. What was Ziso and a few others that excavated there found was that on top of a layer from that was destroyed in the year 70 and abandoned, they have a new layer that people came back after 70 and resettled. And it seems to be this very similar thing in Bourguin. Bourguin, by the way, has a Marchat Mistor, has if Midras is too crowded, there's a amazing system of underground hideaway tunnels that some they say could have been from 70, but most of them are from the Bar Kokhba revolt down by Bourguin. It does take a little bit longer to get there by bus, but if there are 10 groups in Midras, then go to Bourguin. It's especially with small families. It's a much better experience. In any case, what these two sites represent is that in the Judean hills, even though we think it's already destroyed, there's rebirth. Now we should know this because when in the Bar Kokhba revolt, we know that there's fighting all around this area. That means that people came back and rebuilt their homes, which is part of the discussion of what the causes of the Bar Kokhba revolt were. People were expecting to rebuild not just their own homes, but also the temple. And therefore, the Romans declaring that Aelia Capitolina, a pagan city, is going to be built on the ruins of Jerusalem may have led them. They may have had the expectation that 70, just like the first temple period was 70 years, there's also 70 years. You got to get started. And that would have been, let's say, the nail in the coffin to say that there's going to be no rebuilding. So this would have been the cause of revolt. And so seeing those two sites and the rebuilding of a public building, possibly a synagogue, after the destruction of the temple is unique. Now, it's not unique only Jerusalem hills. Even closer to Jerusalem, we have found a very similar thing. As they were building the light rail in an area right over here, this is it right here, between Shuafat and Beit Hanina, they had to excavate underneath the road. So the excavation is a very odd one because it's about like 4 meters wide and 120 meters long, because they just needed to cover the road. And what they found were the remains of a town, a Jewish town, with stone tools, mikvaot, and coins from before 70. So it's a town that's right in the vicinity of Jerusalem, which is just outside the city. That did have a destruction layer at 70, but that was rebuilt after 70. And this was so interesting because we do not find any rebuilding in the city of Jerusalem itself. We do find in, let's say, the Adulam area, which would probably be in the Beit Lechem area and all around, which we haven't excavated, but should have very similar, that there is rebuilding in the villages and the farming villages around, and even a farming villages in the place right in Shuafat was rebuilt. Now, it wasn't destroyed in the Bar Kokhba revolt, as you can see here. So this is from the report. The site attests to the presence of a larger settlement around the time or immediately after the fall of Jerusalem. Furthermore, it provides evidence that the vicinity of Jerusalem, marginal distance 3 kilometers, continued to thrive in the aftermath of the Great Revolt until Bar Kokhba uprising that brought about the swift change. So really the destruction, as awful as destruction was, what we now know from archaeology is that it wasn't completely final. There really was hope after the destruction of even the fall of Masada. There still is hope. But the Bar Kokhba revolt represents the end of that. This, by the way, they did not find a destruction level here. This was probably just abandoned, meaning after the fall of Beitar, which we'll discuss in a second, after the destruction of after the armies were chased out into the caves of the Judean desert, which we think was also part of the last of their things. So that would have been the end. So mentioning Beitar is, according to our sources, the Yerushalmi and a few other midrashim, was the last. This was the Alamo. This was the last stand that they basically did another Masada type thing, and up until relatively recently, just like Masada, when it was excavated, a lot of the stories sounded a little bit, fantastical, like these legends. Where is Beitar? Beitar are the ruins of Batir, which are right next to Walaje. This is the road. There's a tel over here. All of this right now is in the Palestinian Authority, but it's just, you can actually see most of it from Yad Kennedy. Yad Kennedy is a bad angle, but this is Ora Aminadav. So if you don't go all the way up to Yad Kennedy, but you're in the road going up to it and you do an outlook over there, you can see the whole area, which today is beautiful green forests, where were the last battlegrounds of Beitar. Here you can see this is the road, this is the wall, and so you can see it's just on the other side of Batir and Husan. So Beitar right now is in the news because it's under siege, because they found a lot of corona, but this is the siege wall. Okay, this is the site itself on the tel, and Usishkin did a survey there and found parts of the siege engine. He found parts of the siege wall, and he found 2 camps. There were probably 5 camps belonging to 2 Roman legions that in Camp Beitar. Shachar Batz excavated the site just before it moved over to the Palestinian Authority completely. He has not yet published his final report. There are a few preliminary reports, so I wasn't able to get anything, but there are some pictures of it. Beitar represents the end of the end. And according to the legends that are mentioned, as I said, in the Yerushalmi and in a few other later sources, the Romans did not, if you revolt against the Romans once, they get pretty upset with you. They'll squash you, and they'll eventually, if sometimes they were so impressed with some of the armies that revolted against them, they hired you. They said, come and join our army, which many people did. But if you revolt against the Romans twice, let's say like the Dacians or Dacians that are the nation that are depicted in the Trajan's column in Rome, that's Trajan's campaign, Trajan who's Hadrian's father. So what happens to you? So what Hadrian learned from his father is one of the things you do is you completely erase them. There was almost a complete eradication of the Dacians or the Dacians, and they changed the names. They change the name of Dacia or Dacia to Romania. And they changed the name of this region from Judea to Palestina, and that would have been right after the fall of Beitar by Hadrian. There was a miracle, though, and it says that the dead were, even though they were left lying there, according to tradition, again, one of the things that happened on Tisha B'Av, they did not decompose, and they were able, even though it was months after, maybe even years after, that they were able to come back and bury the dead. Because decomposition wasn't there, and you're able to do that. Was considered to be such a miracle that we added in an entire blessing to the grace after meals. Said until today, the blessing of a tovu u'meitiv. And so when you say the tovu u'meitiv after in every single benching, we go back to a time where, again, this is a small little site in the middle of it, but it represented the end of the end of the end, right? So we thought we were done with with this, but it wasn't. Jewish people still continue, and this would have been the end. And so Beitar, you can see there are people that the Beitar movement used Beitar. Now, here's where spelling doesn't help you, because Beitar this is the spelling of Beitar with a tough, but it's got the sign that it's an acronym for Brit Trumpeldor, but Trumpeldor is with a tet. So you can't be too picky on this one. So it's on the sound there. They didn't spell anyway. But the Beitar, Yodfat, and Masada, at the point they still called it with a samech, are all part of the legends that were used for the original groups that began to talk about return. An inscription that was found in a nearby Ma'ayan, a spring, recalls the names of the two Roman legions, the 6th Legion, the 5th Legion, that were encamped around there, and they left there. It's not a semi-official. It's like it was done probably not by the greatest expert, but one that wanted to leave their mark that we were here. If we're still in this region, you should be aware that this entire area are one of the sites that have been declared a UNESCO site in Palestine. Now, Palestine isn't really a country, but it is a country in the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And it's because that this area they have preserved in one of the best ways, the original farming. I have it here, so let's see. I can't open it because I'm using my spotlight. But if you're not familiar, let me turn off the spotlight. And go back. And, oops. So if we open this up for a second, let's see if this will open. And I have to do a new share. This is something I'm just think it's, if you're not familiar with, it's worth looking at. So this is the website, Palestine, Land of Olives and Vines. Milk and honey, right? Cultural landscape of the southern Jerusalem, Batir. I think it's quite ironic that this was the first site that was declared by Palestine as their cultural heritage, which includes the nearby farming village of Batir, which is built on top of the Chorba Natel of Batir. So you can see here the original farming there. Nothing now. They in the brief census list they have the whole criterion. Nothing mentioning that it ever was Jewish, which is interesting, being the but they could be illuminating some of the things that go on in that site. So you talk about destruction and rebirth. There are still some very important chapters that we still haven't finished completely. In any case, let's go back to our second, and we continue. I don't know if any of you remember, but I remember the old movie of Beit Alpha, and it was great because the old movie of Beit Alpha had a picture of, and the Jewish people left into exile, and it had them leaving leaving in the year 70, and then coming back to Beit Alpha in 1930s, 20s, and 30s, and finding the mosaic, which is so classic, because the movie now today is improved, which is so classic because you have the Zionist historiography that has this image of Jews leaving the country and returning in the modern era, which in the way, again, Zionism also wanted to claim at the same time, yet Ben Zvi went through great lengths to try to show how Jews had a physical presence in the country, even if they didn't have a community for so long. But this Beit Alpha is from the 6th or 7th, maybe 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, right? But this wasn't the Judaism, the Talmudic Judaism, Messianic Judaism that they were, that was something that they could fit into the Zionist stories. You had this picture of people of the destruction of the temple, and then you had them coming back, the Zionist pioneers, and Beit Alpha. They find Beit Alpha, which I use as a symbol of the Zionists just say maturing and realizing that their picture of what happened in Jewish history isn't exactly what happened. Before we talk about return, so there is this story, and I've been looking around everywhere for the source of it, that Napoleon, who had a very interesting relationship with the Jewish people, he walked by a synagogue on Tisha B'Av. This is how the story goes. And he heard them all crying, and they said, "Oh, the temple was destroyed." He said, "Oh, really? The temple was destroyed? And where we should help them build it? Whatever. What happened? No. It happened 2,000 years ago." And he said, "Really? They're crying over a temple that was here, that was around 2,000 years ago? If they're still crying over a temple that long, it's going to be rebuilt." Okay, that's the story. By the way, one of the first things that needs to be done according to rabbinic tradition before the temple and the building is reestablishing the court system. This is all things that are in the news. If you're not realizing, I'm alluding to all kinds of stuff that's here. In any case, he actually was one of the first to start a Jewish Sanhedrin. That's something that could be connected. Anyway, so the story. So I looked around the sources. One of them says that it's when he went through Vilna. It wasn't from the Jewish community in France, which there was a small community. There were actually 4 different communities in France. There was a Sephardic community and whatever. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the French Jews of the time of Napoleon, which, by the way, most were against emancipation. It was in Vilna that this story is set. And I looked, probably the only place that this would have happened is the summer of 1812. Summer of 1812, he was going through Vilnius on his way on to Russia. This is the summer that he should have, and the Russians basically, he thought he was going to have a showdown right outside of Vilna, and the Russians just retreated way into Russian territory, which drew Napoleon in, and that was one of the things that led to his downfall. So it could have been in that scenario which a story like this could have happened, although recently asked one of the historians of Napoleon whether or not he knew this story. He did not. It's a Jewish story that appears already in the late 19th century. So it's a story that has early roots. And it could be true, but again, it's one of these legends that I think is more a symbolic story than it is a one that actually happened. But let's talk about things that actually happened. Okay, so let's get back to the rebirth. Ramban. The Ramban wrote a letter, which appears in a few different sources, to his family back in Spain, describing some of the things that he did. And after writing all kinds of personal things, he writes the following: and what did I tell you about what's going on in the land? That it's complete, that its abandonment is immense. The klalo shel davar, kol hamekudash mechavero, charev yoter mechavero. The more holiest site, the more destruction can be found in it. Yerushalayim chareva min hakol. Jerusalem is more destroyed than anything else. Ve'eretz Yehuda yoter min hagalil, and Judah is more than the Galil. Ve'am chorvana hitova me'od ve'yoshvea karov la'alafim. There are a few thousand Jews. Minotrim betocham kegimel me'od. There are 300 people. Sorry. Ve'plitim mecharev al-sultan. Ve'ein Yisrael betocham ki me'at ba'u hatartarim. Barchu mehem misham. Ramban again is coming in 1267, and therefore it's right after the Mongol entry and the Mamelukes, the Balagan. So it's right after the country went through great upheavals, and so this is what the Ramban does. Vihine ziraznu otam. They took the few Jews that were there. Umatzanu bayit charev banui ba'amudei shayish ve'kipa yafa. And they found a beautiful, nice house with a dome and some columns. Velakachnu ota lebeit knesset ki hi ir ha'efker. V'chol rotzeh lizkot l'chorban zocher. And everybody could just take whatever they wanted. V'nadvu li tikun habayit. And the people there said they were going to fix it up. Kvar yitchil b'shipuo. V'shalchu la'ir lahavi misham Shechem, lahavi misham sifrei Torah. They went to Shechem. That apparently there were a Jewish community in Shechem at the time that they brought sifrei Torah. Asher hayu miYerushalayim. V'vilchu sham mevo atater. When the Mongols came, they ran them out to Shechem. V'hinei yitzivu beit knesset. V'sham yitpallu ki rabim ba'im liYerushalayim min Damasek v'tzover et Mitzrayim v'lodut v'l'ot beit hamikdash livkot lav. The people still were coming to visit, but there was no synagogue. So we're all familiar with the Ramban synagogue. Scholars believe that most likely this building wasn't that synagogue, even though it's got columns in it. Most likely the site, the Ramban, was somewhere on what we call Mount Zion today. Again, it's irrelevant for most tourists because this is what's called the Ramban synagogue. But what is the Ramban synagogue? The Ramban synagogue is one of the first synagogues that was built. This community that Ramban describes probably fizzled out. It probably did not continue over to the later communities that were there in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. But the main community that reestablished Jewish community were the Jews that came after the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century and the early 16th. Now, you also had a community that was there a little bit before. So what you can explain here in the Ramban synagogue is this: what was so special about the Ramban synagogue? The Ramban represents modern return, because if you can draw a line when, let's say it was, I said the Jews didn't leave after the first temple, didn't leave after the second temple, they didn't even leave after the Bar Kokhba revolt. They went up to the north and they lived and they prospered in the north for hundreds of years. They didn't leave in the Islamic revolt. There were Jews here under Islamic rule, and they again even prospered and came back and rebuilt a beautiful community. When was the country really the only time period that the city and the country were more or less Judenrein? Was during the Crusader period, when the Crusaders brought all the Jews into the cave and just burnt them all alive. When Benjamin Mutudela, he said there were 2 Jews that he found that were in this city that were working as dyers near David's citadel. So we can say that when the Ramban came in 1267, there are again a few Jews here and there. That's not a community.
he represents the return of the Jewish community to the land. And this more or less begins the process which will continue until the modern period, of course, which a significant renaissance during the 19th and 20th centuries, but the Ramban does represent this return. Another little cool thing about the Ramban is that they found this stamp that says Moshe ben Maimon on the tell right near Akko. Okay, it's the tell right near Akko, and he maybe even did it himself. We know that he writes his tshuvot about how that he actually knew how to do metalwork himself. So apparently when he got off the boat in Akko, wandering around the country, he dropped his wallet, he dropped his stamp, and that was found just there. That's just a cool story. I don't know where they keep the stamp today. I think they lost it, but it was found shortly after. Okay, I'm not going to be as long as I was in the past, so finishing up, I'll just give you a few other little cute things to that in terms of symbolism. When they sat down and had to decide, the different committees, that what was going to be the seal of the Jewish people, so of the land of Israel, the state of Israel. So they chose the menorah, which is a good choice because the menorah really is the only pure Jewish symbol. All the other symbols are things that even the menorah was taken from earlier symbol systems but way in antiquity. For all of Jewish history, the menorah has represented either something, the temple or the people itself, but they took the one from Titus's arch. And if there's any thing that anything that represents the the return, it's the anything that represents the destruction, as I said, wasn't complete in 70, but was this art that the Jewish community in Rome had to go and walk under to embarrass themselves. I made a point there. It was almost 3 weeks that I was there for the first time. I forgot which direction they were supposed to walk in, so I walked back and forth a few times to make sure that I got the right direction. I was good on one side. In any case, but that's, again, a symbol of destruction, a symbol of return. So as we sit with our masks outside, there were masks inside, we can remember that, putting things into perspective, we might be in pretty tough times right now when things are all shut down. But when we go through all of history of destruction, we didn't go through every single story. It would have been pretty depressing if I did. But what I tried to show is that for every story of destruction, we also have a story of return. So hopefully this time period of the down of the curve of our profession will hopefully lead us into our next chapter, which, if hopefully this is what we're looking at, if this is what they think it might look like, but I hope it doesn't take until these things are built till we get started to work again. But that these stories should take us into this now time period of mourning, but with the story of Napoleon and connecting, and with what the rabbis tell us, is that those that mourn Jerusalem will also be meritorious to see it being rebuilt. So we did something okay because we've seen it rebuilt, not completely, but almost, and hopefully we will see it even more rebuilt, maybe without a cable car, speedily in our days. So looking at just some of the things that are said, the Ramban, you saw the letter. It's in the letter. I didn't read every word in the letter. I just gave excerpts of the important stuff that it says in the letter. So if there are any other things people would like to share, like to comment, I am not in a rush because I'm skipping lunch, as I said today. So you're welcome to. And I did hold it down to an hour this time, I think, right? I didn't go too much over. Yeah, perfect. I didn't go over this time. I can do a short tour. Like, I don't have to go an hour and a half. It is possible.
Okay, great. This was very interesting, and it gives I want to say chizuk, but that's not the right word I want to use, because we're talking about, you know, remembering the destruction and the velut and whatever.
Right. And listen, I don't like what I listen, when somebody, and unfortunately we have in our community, when somebody dies and you're at a human velut, there is a true sense of pain and loss. When we talk, I think if you claim you have that on the temple, a little ingenuous. It's hard to do that, even for somebody with the amount of historical consciousness and study and everything. It's still hard to really have that type of pain. Therefore, I think with tourists, it's very good to see that it's hard to see a human hand, but to connect to the human stories, and that's a way that you can feel it. But I think the objective is not necessarily to get to that pain, but to appreciate what was here, to learn about what was here, and to learn about what was a loss. And that really does magnify the job of a tour guide when you're here in Jerusalem to talk about both. You can only really appreciate what we have today when you really appreciate what was here and what was lost, and what was, you know, the amount of time that the amount of generations that to think about to visit Jerusalem was a crazy idea. But today we, you know, my kids are in the Mamad Arova and the Kaitana right now. So it's just like to have those both things playing on, I think it's something that can be uplifting. Again, we're not supposed to be excited, but we shouldn't be both in the macro sense, in a state of, oh, everything is all awful. No, we should put everything in perspective, and what's going on in these few months, use it to rebuild, recharge our batteries, get more information, read more, maybe get the Eshko license, like do all the things you haven't done, whatever. And when they come back, they will come back in full force, and we will have days that we will, we'll be having to looking for days off because we're so busy. But I think
great.
One more thing. I think, you think of the the years of famine and the years of good years, anybody that did the Joseph thing of saving up, now is the years of famine. So that's not a good thing for a fast day, but we're at something of biblical proportions. So we have to deal with it in a biblical way. So if our calamity is a biblical portion, then maybe the return can be the same.
Amen. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. An easy fast for those of you who are, and we'll see you on Sunday.
Back again.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Asher.